Have you ever seen a shadow linger in the corner of your eye, seen a flashing light dart across the sky? Have you ever wished upon a candle to make your wish come true? I'm sure you've told a haunted tale or two. Are you interested in learning the pagan ways, witchcraft, grimoires, candles await? Have you ever seen the living dead and stood still instead of fled? Cryptics are fun, but the universe has our eye. The stars align, shows us our signs, and we're here to discuss the divine. Welcome to Moon Brews, a supernatural podcast, hosted by yours truly, Haley.
Research and recording of Canadian creepies happens on the shared land and traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. A key treaty governing this territory is the Dish with One Spoon Agreement. This treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee people binds them to share and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, settlers, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We all share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, meaning we must take care of the land and the creatures we share it with.
Welcome, wanderers, to journey down the crooked path, a place where the stories are stranger, the shadows stretch longer, and the things that go bump in the night might just be listening. I'm Amanda Joy, your guide into the eerie, the forgotten, and the downright bizarre. Here, we step off the well-lit roads of Canadian creepies and venture into the murky corners of history, folklore, and the unexplained, where the whispers grow louder and the truth is never quite what it seems. So let's take a deep breath, watch your step, and whatever you do, don't look back. Once you start down the crooked path, you never know what might follow.
Clairvoyancy is one of those things that people tend to overcomplicate when really it's pretty simple. It's just intuition that speaks in images, that's it. Some people feel things in their gut, some people hear that little inner voice, but clairvoyant people, they see things, not with their eyes, but with their mind. It's the way a thought suddenly shows up as a picture instead of a sentence. It's that moment where you're thinking about a decision and your brain flashes you a scene, almost like a memory you don't actually remember living. It's subtle, but it's visual. And the most important thing is that it doesn't feel like imagination. It feels like information. Clairvoyancy isn't fortune-telling. It's not about predicting the future. It's more like your intuition uses imagery to help you understand what's going on beneath the surface. It shows you symbols, snapshots, little visual nudges that help you make sense of the things you already know on a deeper level. And because clairvoyancy works in pictures, one of the easiest places for it to show up is in your dreams. When you're asleep, your mind finally gets to stop filtering and editing. It can hand you the images that it's been trying to give you all day. Sometimes the clearest clairvoyant messages don't happen when you're awake at all. They show up at night, in those strange, vivid dreams that feel like they're trying to tell you something. These experiences happen all over the world, and Canada has plenty of them too. A lot of the stories that we hear here come from the Indigenous teachings, especially ones that talk about second sight. But this next story comes from a completely different place. It starts with an Englishman named George Hayward. He was living in Great Britain when he had a sudden, vivid, extrasensory moment that felt too real to ignore. And the strange part is that it wasn't connected to anything happening around him. It was about his brother, more than 4,000 miles away in Canada. On September 18th, 1904, George Hayward jolted awake in his bed in England, heart pounding and covered in cold sweat. He scrambled around in the dark until he finally managed to light a candle. And the second that little flame flickered into life, he grabbed a pencil and whatever paper he could find. He didn't even pause. He just started writing, trying to capture every detail of the nightmare he'd just come out of. something in him knew that he couldn't let it fade. And this dream wasn't like your average half-remembered blur. It was sharp, almost too real. One moment he had been drifting in that soft, hazy place between sleep and waking, and the next, he was dropped into a wild landscape of roaring rivers and dark pine forests. He could smell the pine resin, tanned buckskin, and campfire smoke like he was standing right there. And just beyond the trees, he saw a cluster of teepees, their smoke-stained tops and tall lodge poles cutting stark black shapes against the evening sky. Suddenly, 2 white men rode past the village and stopped near a bog. They tied their horses to a tree and unrolled their wool blankets like they were settling in for the night. In the moonlight, George could see one of them clearly, tall, dark black beard, and he realized with a jolt that it was his brother Edward. While the 2 men were setting up camp, an indigenous woman approached them with a woven basket in her arms. She was just about to step towards them and make herself known when the men started arguing. Startled, she slipped back into the shadows before they noticed her. And that's when everything started to spiral. The argument didn't calm down, it exploded. Voices rose, tempers snapped, and before George could even process what he was seeing, the shorter man grabbed a rifle and shot Edward. George was frozen, horrified, as the killer built a bonfire, lifted Edward's body into the flame, and tossed some of his belongings into the bog like he was trying to erase every single track of Edward. A few days later, and half a world away from George Hayward and his English bedroom, Staff Sergeant Christian Fielstead Anderson of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police was headed out on patrol in the wilds of northwestern Canada. Now, Anderson was one of those, big, rugged, friendly types. He was an Icelander with ice blue eyes and a thick brown mustache. In the Lesser Slave Lake region of north-central Alberta, he was the law, and as the old saying went, he always got his man. That morning, he was riding towards Sucker Creek Reserve on the shores of Lesser Slave Lake. Back in 1899, he had actually been involved in the signing of Treaty 8, the agreement between the Crown and the local Indigenous nations that eventually led to the creation of that very reserve. As he was riding his horse along the trail towards the Cree settlement, he is approached by Mistoos. He is the chief of the Sucker Creek First Nation, and Mistoos lowers his voice and he tells Anderson this horrific story. He proceeds to tell Anderson that several days earlier, 2 white prospectors had set up camp near the reserve. One of them was tall, black-bearded, and clearly an Englishman. A Shiganash, as Mistoos called him, which is basically an indigenous term for a white foreigner, usually British or a fur trader. His partner was a shorter man with a slight limp and went by the name Charlie. Now, 2 days after they arrived, Charlie suddenly takes off with all of the horses, and the Englishman, he's nowhere to be found. And then something even weirder happened. The night the Shiganash had disappeared, the 2 men had built this massive bonfire. But it was a warm and pleasant night. There would have been no reason for a fire that big. The whole thing felt incredibly strange, and it only got stranger when Mistoos' cattle started acting nervous around the ashes, pawing at them like they smelt something they didn't really like. Anderson thanks him for the information and continues on his parole. But early the next day, he rides back to the reserve and steps into the chief's teepee, determined to figure out what exactly is going on. Mistoos greeted him and introduced him to 2 boys, Napasi and Munasi, who had visited the prospectors a few days before. One of the boys is grinning and says that the white men gave us things to eat. They go on to describe how the Englishman had sewn leather over the stock of his gun like he thought it was going to help it shoot straighter. He had done this using a little odd tool, a fingerless leather glove with a big needle built right into the palm. They also said that the Englishman wore a big shiny belt buckle, and that he had a big yellow dog that followed him everywhere. The morning after the Englishman vanished, Charlie had to physically drag the dog away from the campsite. For some reason, it absolutely refused to leave. After talking to the boys, Anderson followed Miss Toos over to the spot where the two prospectors had camped. The chief shows him where the fire is because he knows that there's a ton of ashes there, and he wasn't kidding. For such a mild night, the men had built a huge blaze. There were tons of ashes there. So Anderson, he starts shifting through the ashes with his hands, and it doesn't take him long before he uncovers several charred pieces of bone. I mean, they could be a moose. You can't take every campfire rumor at face value, but still, he wants to be thorough. So he slips some of the fragments into his pocket of his red sarge jacket. He wants to bring it to one of the forest doctors to take a look. A short distance away from this fire pit is a bog. It's the same place that the prospectors likely had gotten their water from. On a hunch, Anderson pulls off his boots, rolls up his yellow-striped breeches, and wades out barefoot, feeling along the muddy bottom with his toes. And before long, Miss Toos has joined in, dragging through this marsh with a rake. It doesn't take long before the chief hauled up a dented, battered kettle. The two boys, they get super excited when they pull the kettle out. They're like, that's it! That's the kettle the white men were using! And so after this, Anderson gives the campsite one last careful look. This time, he notices something that he had missed before. It's a set of slender moccasin tracks only a few days old, leading from the teepees to the camp and back again. He thinks maybe the locals know more about this Englishman's disappearance than they're letting on. Just as he's about to leave, he notices something towards the tree line. For a split second, he catches the sight of long fingers curled over a branch and a pair of dark eyes watching him from the shadow. And then just as quickly, the figure slipped away without a sound. Anderson, he just kind of shrugs it off and makes his way back towards the reserve where he had left his horse. Before leaving, Anderson decides that he's going to stop in on Mosey Gladue. He's a French Cree Métis hunter who lives in a nearby cabin. As Gladue is making tea, Anderson looks around the place and notices there's a lot of animal traps cluttered about. There's mostly fox traps, but one bear trap. So Anderson questions if he's going trapping, to which Gladue says no. All of these traps belong to this guy, Charlie King. He's from Edmonton, and now he's going back by steamer and he wants to sell these traps. And as if right on cue, a pleasant-looking man with a trail-worn Stetson limps into the cabin, and he tips his hat and says, "Hey, I'm Charlie King at your service." Anderson proceeds to tell him that he's looking into the disappearance of his partner, and what happened. King doesn't even hesitate. In a very calm and friendly way, he starts to tell the Mountie about his trip from Edmonton. He says that he met a stranger in the nearby sandhills, a man who called himself Lehman. They camped together near the reserve, and a few days later, Lehman headed out on foot towards Sturgeon Lake to do some prospecting, leaving King in charge of his horses while he was gone. With this, Anderson heads back to the mounted police barracks at Buffalo Bay, northwest of Lesser Slave Lake. Once he got there, he filled his subordinates in on everything. The meeting with Charlie King, the story about the missing partner, all of it. He tells one of the young constables to ride back out to Sturgeon Lake, stop at every indigenous camp along the way and talk to everyone on the trail, and get back here as fast as you can. So the young constable does exactly that. A week later, he returns to the barracks looking like he's ridden through half the province. He's dusty, tired, and worn thin. And he has nothing. He spoke to every single person along the trail to Sturgeon Lake, and not one of them had seen anyone matching the missing man's descriptions. This was a breaking point. Through the Hudson's Bay Company post on the southeast end of Lesser Slave Lake, Anderson secured a warrant for Charlie King's arrest. He found King waiting on the shoreline with his luggage ready to board the SS Midnight Sun, drifting down the Lesser Slave River, then the Athabasca, all the way to Athabasca Landing. And luck wasn't on his side. Anderson arrested him on the spot and hauled him to the RNWMP jail. The local trappers were furious. They were convinced of King's innocence, but Anderson, he wasn't taking any chances. Despite King's protests, Anderson went after the prospector's belongings. Before long, the shed behind the barracks was stacked with 40 fox traps, one massive bear trap, and several pack saddles. Over in the stables, he found 4 of King's horses, all of them marked with a Diamond C brand. After the arrest, Anderson then headed back out to Sucker Creek Reserve and started going through the ashes of the prospector's campfire again, but this time he used a window screen to sift through the debris. It didn't take him long before he uncovered more charred bone fragments, a waistcoat buckle, and half of a large broken needle. Meanwhile, the local Cree were dragging the marsh, and in no time they hauled up a pair of waterlogged boots. Inside one of the boots was a small bundle containing a tie pin top with a gold nugget, a pocket watch with a broken chain, and a round case, like a sterling silver wallet meant for British coins. Tucked in with the items was an empty cartridge shell, which suddenly made the whole case feel a lot more like a crime. Among the muck that the Cree had pulled up from the bog, something else caught Anderson's eye, just a quick glint in the sunlight. He picks up a thin piece of broken steel.
You. Yeah, you. Still haunting the same old fast fashion? Time to dig up something better with Back from the Dead Goods, a Canadian small business where forgotten threads get a second life and sustainability meets spooky. This isn't just upcycled clothing, it's resurrected fashion with an eerie edge. Handpicked, reworked, and revived, every piece is as unique as a ghost story whispered at midnight. And because you're a part of the Canadian Creepies family, you get an exclusive deal. Use code Canadian Creepies at checkout for 10% off. Find them lurking on Instagram, Etsy, and Poshmark. Links are in the episode description. Give your wardrobe a second chance at life, if you dare. Looking for your next obsession? The Creators Collective Podcasts is your gateway to the dark, the chilling, and the downright fascinating. We're a community of independent podcasts with one goal: to share the best in true crime, paranormal tales, folklore, and unexplained mysteries. Whether you crave cold cases that won't stay closed, haunted histories that refuse to be forgotten, or stories that make you sleep with the lights on, there's a show waiting for you in the collective. And when you join us, you're not just listening to one podcast. You're stepping into a world of creators who love this stuff as much as you do. Check out the Creators Collective today. Follow the link in our show notes to discover your next favorite podcast. We'll be waiting for you. Let's take a moment during this break to talk about something that matters. Something that doesn't get to be background noise. The Anishinaabe-Moan word, Ni-ki-na-gana, means we are all related, and we are. But relationship isn't just about words, it's about responsibility. Canadian author Naomi Klein once said, "It is not enough to say that we live on Indigenous land. We have to act as if we do." And one way to do that is by supporting Pay Your Rent, a grassroots mutual aid initiative that offers direct material support to Indigenous organizers across this land. It's not charity, it's rent. For those of us who aren't Indigenous to this place, it's a way to show up differently, to redistribute some of what's been taken. The Pay Your Rent Fund started as a one-time request for help in 2018 and grew into a nonprofit called Ni-ki-na-gana. Your monthly or one-time donation can help provide food, hygiene supplies, housing support, and resources for Indigenous-led resistance and community care. So if you've ever said, "We're all related," ask yourself, are you being a good relative? Visit payyourrent.ca and find out more about how you can be part of something better. Now, back to this case.
Back at the fire pit, he sets it beside the half needle he's already recovered from the ashes, and the two pieces fit together perfectly. Anderson, he has this feeling that there's something more hiding at the bottom of the swamp, so he uses his own money and hires the local Cree to drain it and dredge it properly. After a few days of hard work, the job was done, along with the boots and the soggy bundle they've already found. The marsh gave up one last important clue: a large tarnished square of silver. A Métis man named Casher Cardinal took one look at it and he immediately recognizes it. It's the buckle from the belt worn by the missing Englishman. So Anderson, he's been busy digging up evidence back at Sucker Creek, and Constable Lowe was busy hauling Charlie King to Edmonton. Once there, he hands the suspect over to Inspector Darcy Strickland. He's this big, beefy Mountie with a cheerful streak, and he promptly had King transferred to the RNWMP jail at Fort Saskatchewan, just northeast of the city. With King secured in jail, Lowe starts combing Edmonton for any trace of the man's movements before he headed north. Eventually, in a saddler shop, which is in an area now known as 96th Street, he spots a man repairing a harness strap with this strange little tool. A fingerless leather glove with a needle built right into the palm. Lowe now remembers what the Cree boys had told Anderson about the Englishman, how he had that tool he had used to sew leather onto his gun stock. So Lowe approaches the saddler and asks, "What is that thing?" The saddler grins and explains that it's a sewing palm, something he learned to use back when he was working as a sailor to patch canvas sails. So Lowe asks, "Do you sell many of them?" The man replies, "No, the last one I sold was in August to some fellow heading up Peace River way. He stayed a couple of days sewing canvas panniers for his pack horses." Lowe is now convinced that he's finally found King's trail. He's headed straight to the local brands inspector. But the news isn't what he was hoping for. There's no Diamond C brand registered for either Saskatchewan or Alberta. Because of this, Lowe surmises that the horses must have come across from the U.S. border. After this, Lowe heads over to the Hudson Bay Company retail store. It's one of the last remnants of the days when Fort Edmonton was basically the capital of Canada's Wild West. Grizzled old trader there remembers selling a massive bear trap, the same awkward hunk of metal found in Mosey Gladew's shack, to a black-bearded Englishman just the previous summer. The trader brings out the store's blotter and he points to a line that says, "Yeah, August 14th, Edward Hayward, 10 yards of canvas, 40 fox traps, a list of grub, and 1 bear trap. Paid by check. Actually, I think I still have it." He rummages around for a moment and then he produces a canceled check for $200 issued by the Bank of Montreal in Nelson, BC. It was signed Edward Hayward. This confuses Constable Lowe because Charlie King said his partner's name was Lehman. With this, Lowe heads over to the Edmonton Hotel, hoping to find some answers. And sure enough, on the August 14th register, 2 names sat right under one another: Charles King and Edward Hayward. The hotel manager, Donald Ross, told him that the men's trunks were stored in the basement. Using the keys that had been taken from King when he was arrested, Lowe opened the trunk marked CK. Inside were some old clothes, a few letters from Salt Lake City, and a railway ticket from Fort Macleod to Edmonton. Then things started to get interesting. Another key on King's ring opened the second trunk, the one labeled Edward Hayward. Inside were papers showing that Hayward had once worked as a sailor, a letter from his brother George, and a receipt from Calgary to Edmonton railway ticket dated the exact same day as King's. Lowe brings all of this to Inspector Darcy Strickland, who immediately sent a letter to George Hayward in England, hoping that he could maybe shed some light on his brother's disappearance. Then, this man contacted the brands inspector in Edmonton. He reported selling 4 Diamond C branded horses to an Englishman named Hayward the previous August. That was a solid lead, but it came with a twist. A report from Salt Lake City described Charlie King as a hardworking farmer with a spotless reputation. So now Lowe had 2 conflicting portraits, a man with a clean past and a trail of evidence that kept pointing straight to him as a murderer. Constable Lowe headed back to Lesser Slave Lake and laid everything out that he'd uncovered to Staff Sergeant Anderson. The moment Anderson heard it, he didn't waste a second. He struck out for Nelson, British Columbia, the place where Edward Hayward's check had been issued. He poses as a lumberjack and he tracks down members of the logging crew Hayward had worked with. And the woodcutters, they remember him clearly. Hayward had worn a gold nugget tie pin, a silver belt buckle, and carried a case. All unusual items for that part of the country. And suddenly, everything Anderson had pulled out of the marsh back in Sucker Creek started to line up with who they belonged to. It was looking more and more like those belongings, the buckle, the tie pin, the case, really did belong to Edward Hayward. Back in Edmonton, an English sailor walked into Inspector Darcy Strickland's office and introduced himself as George Hayward, the brother of the missing man. George proceeds to tell this story, and he starts with, "Do you believe in dreams, sir?" Strickland says, "Hardly, but go ahead." So George tells him about the dream. He describes the strange nightmare that he had had the previous September, a dream in which his brother Edward was murdered by his partner. And the details he gave were shockingly close to what the Mounties had found at the crime scene. Details that George shouldn't have known, details that nobody had told him. Then George reaches into his pocket and he pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a clipping from an English newspaper. The day after his dream, he told the story to a friend at his favorite tavern, and it had made its way to the local press. The date of the clipping matched the night of the dream. And that dream happened the exact night that Edward Hayward had disappeared. Inspector Strickland is over the moon when George Hayward finishes his unbelievable story. And he says, "Hey, how would you like to take a run out to Fort Saskatchewan Penitentiary and see if you can identify the subject of your dream?" 2 hours later, George is standing beside Strickland inside of Fort Saskatchewan prison, watching inmates shuffle past in a slow, ordinary line, and then he suddenly grabs the inspector's arm. "That's it," he whispers, just trembling. "It's the same man that I saw kill Ed in my dream." And the man he points to was Charlie King. That September, Charles King finally stood trial for the murder of Edward Hayward. Staff Sergeant Christian Anderson, now acting as Crown Prosecutor, laid out a case built on the testimony of 80 witnesses. They came in from everywhere: the forests of British Columbia, the mountains of Alaska, the plains of Utah, the wilds of northern Alberta, and of course, George Hayward from England. Taken together, their stories formed a clear, chilling picture of what had happened to Edward. Here's what had transpired. On August 14, 1904, Hayward and King met at the Edmonton Hotel and decided to partner up. King was broke, so Hayward paid for their entire outfit: 40 fox traps, the sewing palm, supplies, and 4 horses branded with a diamond C. The two men headed north towards Lesser Slave Lake. Somewhere along that trail, King murdered his English partner. To cover his tracks, he threw some of Hayward's belongings into a nearby marsh and burned the body to ash. And the bone fragments recovered from the fire pit near Sucker Creek Reserve, a doctor did confirm that they were in fact human. Although Anderson had built a very powerful case, one thing still hung in the air: motive. To address it, he called one last witness, a quiet, soft-spoken Cree woman. With a shawl pulled over her head and her eyes fixed on the floor, she told her story. She lived on the Sucker Creek Reserve. On the night that Edward Hayward vanished, she had walked towards the white men's camp to sell a pair of moccasins that she had sewn. Just as she approached, King and Hayward erupted into a furious argument. Terrified, she slipped back into the bush. As she ran, a gunshot cracked behind her, and then the shouting stopped. Superstitious and afraid that she might somehow be blamed, she kept silent when Staff Sergeant Anderson first visited the reserve. For a long time, the only person she confided in was her brother, the same man who had watched Anderson from the willows while the Mountie had searched the campsite for clues. To come to a verdict, the jury didn't have a difficult time. The evidence against Charles King, the belongings in the marsh, the human bone fragments, the forged identity, the Cree woman's testimony, and the uncanny dream recounted by George Hayward was overwhelming. They found him guilty of the murder of Edward Hayward and sentenced him to death. On September 30th, 1905, Charles King was hanged on the gallows at Fort Saskatchewan. And so, from a dream halfway around the world to a fire pit on the edge of the northern bush, the truth of Edward Hayward's fate finally came to light. Justice, slow and winding though the trail had been, had found its way through the wilderness. Thanks for joining me on this eerie journey through Canada's darker corners. If you love this episode of Canadian Creepies, be sure to follow Valerie on Instagram and TikTok at Canadian Creepies. She's the one behind the socials, sharing behind-the-scenes stories, creepy photos, and sneak peeks of upcoming episodes. And if you're craving even more haunted history and twisted folklore, check out my other podcast, Down the Crooked Path. You can follow the show on Instagram and TikTok for even more haunted history, mythical madness, and spine-tingling storytelling. Come say hi, share your own creepy encounters, and help us just keep the weird alive. Until next time, stay curious and stay creepy.